Chapter 7. A New Face. The ride home was uneventful. Danny looked around at the other students on the bus with an apathetic stare. What did they matter now? All day he had been ignored by most and laughed at by the rest. If he was going to be given over to obscurity and ridicule, it would be better to stop caring now than be hurt worse later. So when he sat there, the only one in his seat, it didn't bother him quite as much that the other kids ignored him. Instead, it solidified his resolve. He would be a loner, and he told himself that would be just fine. When he arrived home, his mother was waiting for him, anxiously hoping for good news about his day. But as soon as he walked in the front door, she could tell right away that things had not gone well. Well? Danny raised his eyebrows at her as though he didn't understand. How'd it go? His mother persisted. Fine, he lied. Make many friends today? She asked, hopefully. Right, Danny muttered. They all came running over to me, Mom. There was a long line of kids dying to be my new BFF. She studied her son carefully. Danny never had been good with his feelings, preferring to put up a wall of sarcasm or indifference. She had hoped for more at his new school, but it would appear that hope may have been wasted. In his eyes, she could see the hurt, the burnt emotions, the failed attempts. It's just the first day, she reassured him. Things will get better, soon. Sure, he growled and headed to his room. Once arrived, Danny closed his door and drew out a well-worn notepad. Sitting on the bed, Danny started writing. Everything that came to mind. He just dumped it onto paper. He had heard the technique was called free writing and found that it was his favorite way to get his thoughts out. Over the summer, the practice had become almost religious in nature. He would get depressed about the move, the new school, being separated from his friends, the anger he bore against his parents, all of it. Out would come the notepad. Out would come the pencil. Out would come the feelings. Sometimes it rhymed, and sometimes it was a story. Sometimes it was just a long string of words, and sometimes it was hardly anything at all. He never knew what would happen, and that was the part he loved the most, the surprise. Only with the pencil in his hand and the pad under him was he ever really surprised. Everything else was boring by comparison. Tonight it was poetry. It didn't always rhyme. It didn't always make sense. It was angry and sad and bold and profane. It was offensive and dark and strong. He was a warrior who fought with a pencil. He was a beast that burned with words. He was a killer, and tonight was particularly bloody. But at the end, those sweet moments when he looked back and reread what he had done, Danny was proud. The work was almost powerful and moving. It was a song. Almost a song. Chapter 8. And for my next trick, invisibility. Months passed. Each day Danny walked through his door a little more resolved and a little more aloof. Kids stopped paying attention to him as a rule, and he became progressively more solitary. He was an island in a sea of students, and that was becoming more and more comfortable for Danny. Some would wither under such treatment. Danny embraced it like a friend, the only one he could trust. Girls watched him at a distance, and boys didn't mention him unless it was a joke. Even Peter and Billy eventually stopped noticing him. There were a few incidents, but nothing like the first day. Danny Tuscho simply faded into obscurity. This new state of being had effects beyond school as well. Richard had kept up online, but whenever they got together, it was clear that they were growing apart. Richard was still in a place where he was surrounded by friends and life was great. Danny, on the other hand, was becoming increasingly darker in character and action. At first, Richard could be counted upon to comment on Danny's online status updates, but even those were becoming more sporadic. Danny's permanent sour mood was driving everyone back, Richard included. The days rolled by. Danny found that he looked forward to some of his classes. In his science class, Mr. Ayresman showed them how to condense steam and form rain. Danny was enthralled by the idea of forming something from an apparent nothing. In history class, they were studying World War II, and the idea that a unified force had stood against the bully empire and answered atrocity with a violent response fascinated him. How is it okay to attack an enemy on a global scale, killing hundreds of thousands, but you can't punch a kid in the face for pushing you around? Occasionally, as he was debating these ideas internally, Danny longed for a friend. Just one that he could share with and find some sort of common ground. When the feelings came, and they did more often than Danny cared to admit, he would look around the room and dismiss the idea immediately. He was getting to know these kids now. They were fakes, jerks, and wannabes, in Danny's opinion, and he wanted nothing to do with them. He decided that it would be better to be alone than to be with one of them. That idea firmly planted, Danny sat alone in the cafeteria nearly every day. Occasionally, someone would occupy a seat at the other end of his table, but they never talked, and he never asked them to. What was the point anyway, right? He knew kids that had it worse, ones who hid in the hallways and the bathroom stalls. Danny looked upon them with a sort of contempt. They don't have it worse than I do, he thought, so why hide and cry about it? What's there to care so much about? Kids don't like you, big deal. No one likes me, get over it. On this day, Danny is again the sole occupier of his regular lunchroom table. He raises his hot roll to his lips, and whack! Something strikes him in the back. He drops his roll in his lap and whirls to see what has hit him. Kids are laughing and pointing as Danny spies the broken milk carton on the floor beside him. The feeling of moisture is making its way through his shirt and milk is pooling around his shoes. Instinctively, he turns back to his food and withdraws deeper into his emotional cave. No such luck this time, though. Danny clearly hears a girl describing the events to the lunchroom monitor. He turns and sees Phoebe, the willowy girl from biology, talking with Mrs. Foster and pointing at Nathan. Mrs. Foster walks over to Nathan, who's sitting with Billy and Peter, and beckons the boy to follow him. Phoebe looks at Danny and smiles as she tucks a few strands of her long brown hair behind an ear. She then returns to her seat without ever talking to him. What just happened? Danny asked himself. As the cafeteria was clearing, Danny positioned himself close to Phoebe and looked for a chance to talk to her. He couldn't imagine what would compel her to stick up for him. Danny had never paid the girl much attention before. In his mind, she was weird and quiet and too clean-cut. She wore nice clothes and read books and acted a little spacey in Danny's opinion. Frankly, he thought she was strange and never considered talking to her before. Now he saw something he hadn't seen before. Her hair flowed when she walked. Her smile glowed. He felt warm and happy looking at her. He had to talk to her. As the crowd began to scatter, Danny kept pace with Phoebe until he was right next to her. She looked at him, smiled again, and went back to talking with her friends. Danny felt as though he could survive off of that smile alone. He had no idea how attention-starved he'd become. He had no idea how much he needed acknowledgement. Even now, feeding from the scraps of Phoebe's relationship table, he still didn't recognize the need within him. All he knew was that this girl was special, and this girl made him feel amazing, and that she probably didn't think he was a total freak, since she stood up for him. Again, Phoebe looked back and saw Danny. This time he was closer and smiling stupidly at her. She laughed and asked, "Stalk much?" "Huh? Do you often stalk girls, Danny Tuscho, or just me?" He felt his face flush as he fought with his tongue to say something, anything that didn't make him sound like his brain was stunted. "No, just you." "Fail." "Just me, huh?" There's that smile again. "Cool," she says with a nod. "Why?" he sputters. "Why'd I stick up for you?" "Yeah," Danny says, getting more comfortable talking to a human his age. "What do you care what they do?" "I don't know," she says. "Have her eyes always been that brown?" "I guess," she continued, "that I hated seeing them pick on you. Nathan, Billy, Peter are jerks, and you're not." "How do you know?" he asks, trying to sound dark and mysterious. Phoebe laughs at him, but he doesn't care. In fact, he finds he's laughing too, and has no idea why. "Come on, Danny. You do your work. You don't pick on other students. You talk politely to the teachers." She looks at her shoes and says, "Seems to me like you're a good one." He looks up at her with his jaw hanging. "A little dark," she quickly adds, "and a little withdrawn." His heart sinks a notch until she says, "But it works for you." He tries to give her his most thoughtful, dark artist look, and she laughs and says, "Okay, stop that. It's creepy." He pushes a hand through his shaggy hair, and she says, "Okay, now you do me." "What?" he blurts, suddenly highly uncomfortable. "I just told you my impressions of you. Now it's time for you to share your impressions of me. Do me." She has no idea what she's doing to me, he thinks, as he debates what to tell her. "Well," he starts with a sigh, "I guess I thought you were pretty weird." And with those few words, her whole countenance changed. She went from this blessed vision to a statue in an immediate transition. "Weird?" she asked, as though trying to make certain she heard him correctly. "Yeah," he stammers. Dang, I don't know. Everyone has just seemed so different at this school. The kids here either ignore me or throw food at me. I guess you're weird because you don't do either of those. You stood up for me, and I never saw that coming." "You're weird, but that's okay." "Ah, dang, never mind," he says with a dismissive wave. He knows he's just blown it, and not for the first time at Giant Hills Middle School. He wishes he was invisible. "Danny," Phoebe calls as he starts to walk away. He turns, and the statue has become alive again. "I think you're weird too." And with that, she trots off to class. "She is going to ruin my life," he says to no one in particular. "I just know it." That night, Danny wrote more in one sitting than he had in the last month. His writing was fiery and angry, with brilliant flashes of light. He was story writing, and his hero was a young boy from a poor family, cast from his homeland and wandering a black desert. He wrote of the creatures the boy found, and how the environment tried to consume him. He wrote of a wise old man, and how the man helped the boy find the light in a world of gloom. Danny wrote of the light with a shaking hand. It was the figure of a girl, with a voice like bells and a name that no one could speak. She was a giver of life and a rescuer to the lost, the one that could bring the desert out of darkness and into peace. Danny went to sleep that night with a mind filled with images of a girl bathed in light, and woke feeling as though life was not as bad as he may have previously thought. It was hard to maintain the idea that life was all bad with people in the world like Phoebe. On the bus, his theory was immediately put to the test. Barely had Danny sat down when Peter grabbed his backpack from off the seat and lifted it so Danny couldn't snatch it back. "Give it back," Danny said hotly, staring hard at Peter. Danny swiped angrily at the bag, but Peter kept pulling it back and just out of reach. Each cry for Peter to return the bag was answered with laughter. "Give it back now," Danny growled. Peter looked at Billy and laughed at Danny's sudden display of courage. "What are you going to do about it?" teased Peter, lifting it even more out of reach. Now, kneeling in his seat, Danny lunged for the bag, and Peter spun to keep it away. He then leaned over to the open window and hung Danny's book bag out the window. "Cookie Monster feeling tough?" Peter jeered. "Fine. Go to school without your bag." "No," Danny hollered. "Don't." "What in the world is going on back there?" came the voice of the driver. The bus had stopped and was picking up some more students. Mr. Tom, the bus driver, pointed at Peter and said, "You, what are you doing with that bag?" "Put it down." Danny took the opportunity to snatch his bag back and find another seat. "Peter Jackson," Mr. Tom threatened, "if I see behavior like that again, young man, I will not hesitate to report you to the principal's office. Do you understand me?" With little amount of satisfaction, Danny watched as Peter squirmed in his seat and muttered curses at the bus driver. When Peter looked up, he was clearly blaming Danny for getting in trouble. A week ago, or even a day ago, Danny would have shaken under his gaze. Now Danny saw the bully in a new light. Peter may have been physically bigger than Danny, but he looked small and mean, and not quite as dangerous. Danny's own personal black desert seemed a little brighter as he held his bag to his chest, despite the creature sitting up the aisle staring back at him. He had stood up to Peter for the first time, and new power seemed to flow through him. Life may be terrible, but it has its moments, Danny thought to himself. At lunch, Danny had begun to grow accustomed to his routine. He would get his food, find the seat at his normal table, and eat his meal alone. Today, though, Danny was hoping for more. After their encounter yesterday, Danny was hoping to find a seat with Phoebe. With anticipation bubbling through his veins, Danny entered the cafeteria and scanned the crowd of faces for her. He spotted Phoebe standing in line, waiting to be served. For a moment, Danny debated sitting at her table and surprising her when she came to sit down, but he feared that would be creepy and voted against it. Instead, he sat down at his usual spot and prayed for a miracle. Danny's heart plummeted as Phoebe walked right by him and sat at her normal seat after getting her lunch. He was so excited at the thought that she might sit with him that the rejection was all the more painful. He stared at her as she was laughing and talking with her friends, and wondered if he had imagined it all. Maybe she didn't care. Maybe she was just faking. As each moment passed, Danny felt more certain that Phoebe never liked him, and he was a huge idiot for even thinking it. Then she looked his way. Danny was morosely pushing his sandwich into his mouth when he spied Phoebe looking at him. She was smiling broadly and dividing her time between listening to a friend and looking at Danny. He wasn't sure what to make of this. Minutes ago, he didn't exist, and now he's just about all she can look at. How does that work? How is it possible to be both nothing and highly interesting all at once. One moment it's like Danny isn't there, and the next she can't keep her eyes off him. Danny gives the situation little thought before he becomes consumed with the game. She looks, and he looks away. He looks, and she goes back to talking to her friends. Back and forth, one avoiding the gaze of the other, both smiling at all the attention they're getting. Just before the bell rang for them to clear the cafeteria, Danny found her gaze and held it. How had he never noticed how deep the color was in her eyes? Her smile was subtle, but rang in his chest like a gong. The bell went off, and Danny just sat there, watching as the group at Phoebe's table stood and cleared out. He watched her walking away, still trading smiles and feeling more alive than ever. "Hey, freak!" The voice was shrill and offensive in comparison to the state Danny had just been in. He turned and found the sneering faces of Peter and Billy. "You don't think we're done yet, do you?" Peter continued. "We're not even close, freak." Danny looked away and grabbed his bag. "Not so big now, huh?" Peter mocked. He tried to ignore him as Danny stood from the table and headed for the door. "See you soon, Danny." Although he heard him, he didn't turn around. Danny didn't feel like he was in any condition to handle Peter or Billy at the moment. To be so happy just a moment ago to now feeling like he could throw up, it was too much for Danny. So he put the calls and heckling behind him and headed to the media center. The next period was a study hall for Danny. He was given his choice of the cafeteria or the media center, and he chose the latter without giving it a moment's thought. In the library, it was quiet, peaceful, and the only place in the school that Danny felt truly safe. He wasn't expected to interact with anyone else, which was always his preference when he was working. In fact, since talking was discouraged, Danny could focus on his work, write or draw, or just be alone with his thoughts for 90 minutes until he had to go to his final class of the day without fear of an unwanted interruption. Today, Danny drew out a notebook and a pencil. He had work from his history class that he could be working on, but that wasn't what was motivating him. And frankly, when you were in study hall, all you had to do was stay quiet, look busy, and the teachers would leave you alone. So often Danny would write or draw in a chair in the corner undisturbed the whole time. Today, he hoped for a chance to try something different and not be disturbed. Danny tapped the pencil on the paper nervously. He had never tried something like this before. When he wrote, it was always just spewing words onto paper as fast as he could write them. Not once had he ever tried to plan a story or a scene or even a single line. Danny let the words dump out of a place deep inside of him and pour over the paper, allowing the story to come to life before his eyes. But it seemed more important than that. For the first time, he knew what he wanted to write the moment he sat down. He wanted to write about Phoebe. Danny looked over his notebook and scanned the library. Kids perusing the rows of books, sitting at tables, and talking quietly. The librarian was nowhere to be seen, but that didn't bother Danny. Mrs. Bender had always been nice to him. In fact, on more than one occasion, the librarian had told Danny that her life would be easier if more kids were like him. Quiet, polite, you stay busy, can find any book without help. "Yeah," Mrs. Bender had confessed last time they had talked, "you're more of a pleasure than most, Mr. Tuscho." The words had encouraged him greatly when they were said, but now they were a source of concern. He liked it that Mrs. Bender thought well of him, but once he started writing, he was terribly afraid of anyone coming over and reading what he was doing. Those were to be his feelings, his confession to himself about the person he couldn't go a minute without thinking about. And the last thing he wanted was the experience to be corrupted by someone else. So when he was Sure the coast was clear, he began to explore what he thought about Phoebe. He wrote the predictable lines first. He wrote about how she looked and the obvious things about her appearance. Kind of tall, slim, brown hair. He explored the topic of her expressions and her effect on her surroundings. Then he delved a little deeper. Danny wrote about how she made him feel. He wrote about the way she had flipped a switch within him and how he now saw the world differently. Danny told the story of how he felt before Phoebe had talked to him and how he didn't even know himself anymore. He confessed to his paper the fear of never finding someone who would understand him. And now, Danny? At the sound of the librarian's voice, Danny slapped his hands over the paper before him and stared up at Mrs. Bender with a wild expression. Sorry to interrupt, she said with a knowing smile, but the bell has rung. It's time for you to head to your next class. Yeah, Danny said hurriedly as he flipped the notebook closed and stuffed his things into his bag. As Danny stood and headed to the door, Mrs. Bender called to him. She must be some girl, Danny. Oh no, she read it. What? He answered, feigning ignorance. It's just that no boy I've ever seen acts that way unless he was writing about a girl, and she must be really special to produce such a reaction in such a normally quiet young man. The librarian smiled, and Danny felt his face flush. Hi, Danny. He turned to find that Phoebe had just entered the library. Hi, Phoebe, he said in a shaky voice. Do you have study hall right now? Phoebe asked excitedly. No, I just finished. Too bad, she replied, and walked off to the same corner he was in. See you later, Danny. Yeah, later. He watched her go and realized that he wasn't breathing normally. Danny took a deep breath and turned to find Mrs. Bender still standing there. Yep, she said with a grin. Must be a pretty special girl. Chapter 9. The Wingman. The next day, Danny boards the bus, a little nervous, but determined to not have a repeat of yesterday's events. Billy and Peter were sitting in their normal seats. Danny saw Peter tap Billy in the arm and pointed at him as he approached. Good morning, Daniel, said Peter in a sarcastic tone. Won't you come sit with us? Danny just kept walking past them, staring at the rear wall of the bus. Wait, where are you going, Daniel? Billy asked. Daniel? Still, he kept walking, headed off toward the back of the bus. Danny spotted Patrick, a kid from his math class, sitting alone. Patrick was a quiet kid who kept mostly to himself, though he had chatted with Danny a couple of times about this and that. Mostly, Patrick was interested in the newest first-person shooter games, which Danny couldn't afford, and role-playing card games, which Danny could care less about. While he wasn't really impressed with Patrick, it was a safe bet that Danny wasn't going to be denied a place by him. Care if I sit here? Danny muttered to Patrick. Nope, Patrick replied, pulling his bag to himself to make room. Whatever. Danny thanked him and took a seat. Dude, are they dating? Came Billy's voice over the din. Daniel and Patrick, they are such a cute couple, he proclaimed to the laughter of a few. Shut up, Billy, snapped a voice behind Danny. He turned to see the scowling face of one of the girls from science. Molly? Mary? Danny couldn't remember her name. Ooh, Billy called back in a mocking tone, then turned around and started talking to Peter. The girl looked at Danny, still glaring. He's such a jerk, she said. I saw what he did yesterday. Yeah, Danny replied, not really excited that the girl was bringing that up again. She then sat back in her seat and started talking with the girl next to her. Stacy was talking about you yesterday, said Patrick in a quiet voice. Who? Danny asked, and Patrick tilted his head to the girl behind them. Oh, said Danny. She was talking to Molly about you. Molly is the one who just yelled at Billy? Danny asked. No, that was Stacy. Molly's the girl next to her. Oh, Danny said again. Patrick gave him a look like, really? After Danny didn't reply, he went on. Stacy said that she thought you were cute. At the words, Danny felt himself blush and swell a little with pride. He'd never been called cute by a girl before, at least that he knew of. The sensation was a little intoxicating. He turned and smiled at Patrick. Really? Yeah, he admitted. And then Molly said she thought you were weird. Danny's heart sank a little, but not very much, to tell you the truth. Stacy defended you, but Molly kept saying that you were dark and a little creepy. Creepy? Yeah, Patrick explained. Like you don't talk to anyone. You just walk around not talking and stuff. Danny realized at that moment they had never considered people might be watching him. He thought he was alone in the school. Turns out he might be wrong. You really should try being a normal human being for a while. I hear that it's a good idea. What about you? Are you a normal human being, Patrick? Danny asked. Me? No, but that's okay, he told Danny. Being normal just isn't for me. Now you, he said, getting the focus back on Danny, you're like the bad guy that everyone likes. You wear black, stand up to bullies. Whoa, Danny interrupted. I haven't stood up to any bullies. Yesterday, ring a bell? All I did was tell Peter to give me my bag back. That's it, Danny assured him. Whatever you say, from here it looked like you were going to punch that jerk in the face, and we were all rooting for you. We? Danny asked, eyebrows raised. Yeah, you know, basically everyone sitting over here, including Stacy. I think she likes you. Shut up, dude, Danny quickly responded. Whatever, Patrick mumbled. Say what you want. She likes you. You're like the actor who was the captain in the Caribbean, only not so old. And he talks more than you. And his hair is longer. And he has money. And lots of fans. And money. And, okay, I get it. Just say he and I are nothing alike, all right? Nah, man, Patrick reassured Danny. Both of you have that dark mystery dude kind of thing about you, you know? Mystery dude? Oh, whatever, man. You know what I mean. Not really, Danny admitted truthfully. You are hopeless, Danny, Patrick sighed. You know that? Yeah, Danny said with a small smile. I'm a total loser. For the rest of the day, Danny hung out with Patrick. He followed him when Patrick joined a group of friends in the hall and even talked with most of them. Most of the kids recognized Danny from class, and all of them seemed nice enough. Yet even though no one tried to exclude Danny, he still felt like an outsider. These kids all knew each other and had things to talk about and share. Danny, on the other hand, knew some of their names but didn't know anything about them. If it wasn't for Patrick, he wouldn't have lasted more than a few moments. Every time Danny would start to feel like leaving, Patrick would ask him a question, share a comment with him, or tell one of the other kids something he had heard Danny say. Danny would then be forced to continue to participate and not retreat quite yet. The practice was miserable and satisfying all at once. He hated it when people put him on the spot, but it was so nice to know he had the attention of his peers. What's like the ultimate fear? One of them asked. Kids started yelling out things like snakes, spiders, and heights. One boy said he was afraid of falling. Another said he was afraid of birds. Danny, one of them said. Maybe his name was Stephen. Danny was never very good with names. What are you afraid of? Without needing to think about it or taking the time to consider what he was about to say, Danny blurted out his ultimate fear. Being alone forever. The other kids just stared at him for a moment. Danny realized that he had broken some rule, but he wasn't sure which one. Then all at once, every kid in the group said, "Later," and turned to walk off. Danny felt humiliated. He had shared his innermost fear, the idea of being forced to live without friends or family or anyone for his entire life, and now no one wanted to be around him. But just as Danny hung his head and turned to leave, Patrick started laughing. Then the other boys began to laugh as well. When Danny looked up, he realized that none of the kids were really going. "Settle down, Danny," Patrick laughed. "Just a joke, man." At lunchtime, Danny decided to ride the good feelings from earlier and be bold. He made it to the cafeteria before most, got his food, and sat down at Phoebe's normal table before she or her friends got there. When they walked in, Danny felt shaky and debated bailing at the attempt. When they got their food, Danny told himself that it wasn't too late to just go back to his old table. When the first of Phoebe's group walked over and saw him sitting in their place, Danny reminded himself that he could still run for it. It wasn't until the girls frowned at Danny and walked on to another table that he felt his mistake may have been bigger than he meant. When Phoebe came over and saw him, she smiled, spotted her friend's new spot, and went off to sit with them. Danny was devastated. He felt like he had put his neck out and just had his head chopped off. How could I have been so stupid? He asked himself. Of course they would leave. I mean, why wouldn't they? Danny was so busy hanging his head and pouting that he didn't notice Phoebe trying to get his attention. "Hey, buddy," his father said that night. "How's school?" "Fine," Danny lied. His father was not so easily conned, though. "Rough day?" "Want to tell me what's going on?" "Nothing. It's just..." "Dad?" "Yeah," the father replied. "How do you make someone like you?" "Love potion," the father answered happily. "Dad," Danny said in a humorless voice. "The truth?" "Mm-hmm," Danny replied a little nervously. "You don't, pal," he said rather directly. Danny's head began to hang a little lower. Hey, the father said in what he hoped was a soothing voice. "You don't make people like you. You don't make people like you, and you don't want it to be like that anyway." Making people like you? No. What you want to do is just be yourself. Find that thing that makes you unique and share that. What if they don't like me? Then they probably aren't the type of person you want as a friend anyway, pal. What makes me special? Danny contemplates. What makes me unique? Chapter 10. Push and Pull. "Patrick," Danny asked while the bus motored off to school, "what makes you special?" "I can write with my feet," he replied without a pause. "No, I mean, wait, what?" "I hold the pencil between my first and second toe, and I can write like that all day." "Seriously?" Danny asked, not believing what he was hearing. "It's how I did my homework last night," the boy answered in a matter-of-fact tone. "Well, I guess..." "Why?" Patrick asked, giving Danny a strange look. "What makes you special?" "I'm pretty sure nothing," Danny answered, feeling depressed that he was less special than the weird kid who wrote with his feet. "No, really," Patrick persisted. "What do you do well? What do you like doing that not everyone does?" "I like schoolwork," he said, "and writing." "What do you write?" "Everything," Danny answered with a shrug. "But lots of people like to write. That's not special." "Whatever, I can't write stories or poetry or stuff like that." "Sure you can," Danny says, trying to be encouraging. "No," Patrick assured him, "I can't." Danny and Patrick sat in silence for a few beats, just listening to the hum of the motor and the chatter of the kids on the bus. "You really think that writing is special?" "Dang, Danny," Patrick said in an exasperated tone. "I don't know. But you know what my dad says? He says that it's not what you do that makes you different. It's how you do it. What does that mean? It means if you're going to do something, then don't be boring when you do it. Hi, Danny. Danny had been lost in thought all day, trying to figure out how he could be more interesting. He had decided that if he was going to get Phoebe's attention, then he needed to be more exciting. Danny had been so consumed with his thoughts that he didn't notice her walking behind him. Hi, Danny. Hi, Danny said excitedly when he turned and found Phoebe. It felt strange to him to think about a person most of the day, and then to turn and see them standing right there. What's up? Nothing, pirate. Pirate? Yeah, Phoebe said with a smile. You stole our table yesterday. Crap. Yeah, he... Why? She asked in a non-threatening tone. Phoebe seemed truly interested, but not at all offended. I don't know, Danny paused. What would he tell her? That he sat there to be closer to her? That he wanted to hang out with her? And that seemed like the right thing to do? That he wanted to show Phoebe that he was bold and interesting and worth hanging out with? He couldn't decide what to say, so he just repeated, I don't know. Phoebe looked a little disappointed and said, Oh, well, Rachel was really mad at you. You were sitting in her seat. She can have it back, Danny answered. Tell her that her seat smelled funny. Phoebe laughed out loud at the remark, covering her mouth with a hand. I will, she promised, but she won't like that. I write stories, he announced out of nowhere. What? Phoebe asked, genuinely surprised by the seeming randomness of the comment. Crap. Sorry, yeah, I like to write short stories, he said rather awkwardly. Danny was pretty sure that he was acting mentally handicapped, but Phoebe looked at him with interest written all over her face. Really? Cool, she said. What? Danny asked, stunned by the girl's response. You think so? Yeah. What do you write about? Don't be lame, Danny thought. Please, don't be lame. He took a breath and gave a weak smile. Everything, he shared. I don't know. I sit down and write stories that come to me. Like what? She pressed. Do you write stories about girls? Sometimes, Danny admitted with a shy smile. What else? I wrote a story about a bird that couldn't fly. A bird that couldn't fly? Why couldn't he fly? Because a girl had caught him and cut off his wings, Danny said, eyes on his feet. Gross, Phoebe blurted. Why would she do that? Because she loved the bird and never wanted him to leave. He told her that he was a bird and that someday he was going to fly away. It's who he was. So she waited until he was sleeping and cut off his wings. That is so wrong, Phoebe said, her brow furrowed. It's okay, Danny assured her. The bird was much happier. You see, he was awake when she cut his wings off. He let her do it. Why? Phoebe demanded. Danny could see that the story was getting her progressively more upset. Why would the bird stop being a bird for the girl? Because, Danny said, looking up at Phoebe. He wanted her to love him, and he decided that he would do anything for her. He would have cut off his own wings if he could just stay with her. Phoebe blushed and looked away. Danny wondered what he had said to make her act that way. It's romantic, but sick, Danny Tuscho. That's what they tell me, he joked. Can I read it? Danny had never shown his stories to other kids. He had been too afraid they would think he was a freak to risk finding someone who would actually like them. But looking in Phoebe's eyes, there was really only one possible answer. Sure, he promised. Awesome, she said, stepping into a classroom. Bye, Danny. As he called goodbye to Phoebe, Danny could hear her friends saying his name, and he didn't even want to know what they were saying about him. But then he saw Phoebe look back at him. That smile of hers, reaching out and plucking a string deep inside his chest. Danny realized that he didn't care what the other girls thought. As long as Phoebe liked him, life would make sense. Now, he thought, I just have to go home and write a story about a girl and a bird. At lunchtime, Danny was heading to the cafeteria, debating if he should go back to his old table or steal Phoebe's again. Hey, Puddles, the cry broke Danny's train of thought, and he looked up to find Peter and Billy coming at him. Where you going, huh? Danny looked around, and he saw that nearly every kid in the hall was looking at him. He tried to walk around the boys, but Billy put a hand on his chest to stop him. Not so fast, Puddles, he said harshly. You got us in trouble on the bus the other day. You mean when you took my bag and tried to throw it out the window? All your crying and screaming ended up getting us reported to the office, Peter growled, and that's your fault. My fault? You took my bag. Fight, yelled one of the kids nearby. I'm going to enjoy beating you, Peter said darkly. Fight, said another student. Danny searched the hall, but there were no teachers around. Ain't nobody going to help a freak like you, Billy spouted, and he gave Danny a shove that made him fall into another student. That student pushed Danny back at Billy, who gave him another shove. This time, Danny fell to the floor. Panic, salted with anger, started to creep up, and Danny felt like he was going to crack. He scrambled to his feet under the jeers of Peter and Billy and the cries of "Fight! Fight! Fight!" coming from the crowd. Then he saw Phoebe standing behind Peter. She looked scared, like she was convinced Danny was about to be murdered. That's when something inside Danny snapped. But before he could think about it, Danny drew back and socked Peter in the nose as hard as he could. The crack made the crowd go silent for just a moment before the cheers blasted the halls. Peter doubled over and smashed his palms into his face. When he came up, blood was seeping around his fingers and down his chin. Danny's hand began to throb in time with the rooting of the spectators. He looked up to find Phoebe. As he did so, a lightning bolt of pain struck Danny in the temple. The world whirred around him, and his hearing went fuzzy. The voices and shouts of the children became a rolling murmur like a strange soundtrack while Danny waited for the spinning to stop and his head to right itself. He'd never been punched before. He knew it would hurt, and he knew that you never wanted to get punched first. Now he understood why. As his vision came back into focus, the roar of the students became the central sound, and Danny spotted Billy shaking his hand. Get away from me, Danny roared at him. Instead of fleeing, Billy took a step at Danny. Upon seeing this, Danny's fight reflex once again took over, and he pulled back his fist and let one fly at Billy's head, who raised his hands to protect himself. Danny punched him several times in the hands and face before a pair of arms wrapped around him and dragged Danny away from Billy. Danny struggled to break free of the grasp. That's enough, the voice in Danny's ear roared. Looking up, Danny recognized the PE teacher, Mr. Waits. Danny looked back at Peter and Billy. Peter had a small pool of blood at his feet and red stains down his face and shirt. Danny thought he looked small and scared with those tears welling in his eyes. Billy looked like he had just fallen from a building. He was wobbling, hiding his face in his hands and working to get away from the group and his teachers trying to help him and Peter. You too, Mr. Waits boomed, pointing around Danny. Office. At the command, two teachers took the boys by an arm, more to help them keep balance than to keep them from running away. And so the six of them, the three students and the three teachers, made quite the parade as they wove their way towards the principal's office. While they went, Phoebe, Stacy, Mary Patrick, and others began to cry out at Mr. Waits, declaring Danny was the victim of the event. They attacked him, Patrick yelled. I saw it, Mr. Waits, Mary declared in a confident tone. Billy and Peter were trying to hurt Danny, and Danny had to fight back. Danny didn't do anything wrong, cried Phoebe. Yeah, agreed a boy Danny didn't even know. They attacked him, and Danny walloped them good. Not helpful, Danny thought. Cool, but not helpful. All right, enough, Mr. Waits said to the crowd. Everyone has some place to be, and I suggest you go there. That includes you, Miss Ray. Phoebe stuck out her chin at the PE teacher and announced, I'm going to the principal, and marched off ahead of the group. Several others followed her, and by the time Danny and Mr. Waits made it to the office, he could hear the sounds of young, excited voices emanating behind Mr. Lincoln's door. Sit, Mr. Waits ordered, pointing at a chair. Billy, Peter, and their escorts came in just after Danny sat down. Billy growled and stepped at Danny, but Mr. Waits put a quick end to that. No, you don't, he said. You two, over here. He directed them to chairs across the room. Out of Mr. Lincoln's office came a stream of students headed by Phoebe and Patrick. We told him it wasn't your fault, she assured Danny. We told him that they attacked you, that you just had to defend yourself. That's enough, Miss Ray, came the voice from within the principal's office. The students piled out of the office, saying goodbye to Danny, mingled with whispers of, good job, and you kicked their butts. Mr. Lincoln stood over the three boys. What happened, Willie? I don't know, Mr. Waits admitted. I heard kids yelling about a fight. When I got there, this one, he said, pointing to Danny, was wailing on this one, he said, now pointing at Billy, and the other one was pretty bashed up. Is the nurse coming to clean up Peter? The principal asked. Here I am, announced Mrs. Bradford, the school nurse. Have a look at Peter there, would you? Mr. Lincoln requested. Peter flinched and burbled as the nurse drew the boy's hands away from his swollen nose. Danny felt a small swell of pride looking at Peter's distorted hood ornament. Young man, the principal began, drawing attention back to Mr. Lincoln. What's your name? Danny Tuscho, sir. What happened, Mr. Tuscho? I was walking to class, and these two jumped me. Whatever, Billy roared. He jumped us. Mr. Thompson, you will have your chance to speak, Mr. Lincoln promised. Now, he said, looking back at Danny, what happened next? Danny told the principal about how he tried to get away, but they wouldn't let him. How Billy had shoved him to the ground, and how he knew that they were going to pummel him if he didn't do something. All the while, Billy kept interrupting to insist that the fight was Danny's fault. And each time he would, Mr. Lincoln would remind him to be quiet. In the end, Mr. Lincoln stood by the boys and said, your parents will be called. The three of you are going to be suspended for the rest of the day for fighting. Billy and Peter complained of how unfair the decision was, but Danny just sat in silence. If I hear that you three are having any trouble of this kind again, the suspension will be for 2 weeks, with another 2 weeks of detention after you return. Do you understand? The principal looked each of them in the eye. Fighting? Mr. Tuscho asked once they got into the car. He had been nearly silent in the office, not saying a word to Danny, and only talking to the principal when necessary. When they walked to the car, it was a hushed march. Now, in the privacy of the vehicle, Danny's father finally starts to feel comfortable enough to confront his son. Dad, Danny begins, but his father doesn't allow more than that. Look, I know it's been a rough transition. It's been tough for all of us, but fighting? Really? The disappointment in his voice is more than apparent. There's always a way to solve problems without fighting, Danny. They were going to pound me. Then you leave to get a teacher, he snapped back. You don't beat them until they need medical attention. They steal my bag on the bus and then try to kick my ass. And I'm the bad guy? Watch your mouth, Danny, his father warned him. We'll talk more about this later. Dad! Later. But sure enough, later came and found Danny alone in his room. The world seemed cold, heartless, and completely unfair. He pressed the ice pack into the cut above his eye and tried not to think about life too much. On the other side of the house, Mr. Tuscho was wrestling with his own thoughts. He wanted Danny to fit in, but he also didn't want him to get bullied. He needed his son to have something he could focus on and get some of his angst out. But what? Mr. Tuscho remembered back to when he was a teen and how one gift from his father made all the difference to him when he was young and having trouble finding his identity in the world. Mr. Tuscho went to his closet and drew out an old guitar case. Maybe it was time to give Danny the same chance he had received.